Hi, everybody. My name is Carter Allagood. I manage sales and client services at Capsim, and I'd like to welcome you to our first installment of Capsim's Crash Course in Program Evaluation. This webinar is a continuation of our accreditation and assessment series, which, if you did not attend those, they are available on our website. Please feel free to go back and take a look at those. We're really excited to share Dr. Erich Dierdorff's insight into program evaluation in this webinar. Stay tuned, by the way, for at the end we have a special offer for everybody who attends this webinar, and we will announce that after Erich finishes talking. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dierdorff. Erich is an associate professor of management at DePaul University. He's an expert in team learning and assessment. In addition to being an award-winning teacher and publishing over 30 articles in leading management journals, Erich has served on accreditation committees and worked as a consultant with universities to help craft their accreditation reports. Thank you, Erich, for joining us today again.
Well, thank you, Carter. Apparently I'm doing something well. I keep getting invited back to the show. I feel like Alec Baldwin on Saturday Night Live or something like that. I guess it's a good thing, although my voice isn't nearly as endearing. Hello, everyone out there. Thank you for joining today. We've got a great number of attendees. It's fantastic. Who would have thought on a crash course for program evaluation? A little truth in advertising here. We do say an executive doctorate in program evaluation in 30 minutes or less. I hate to break it to you, there's really not an executive doctorate at the end, but you will be an evaluation guru, and I promise, as advertised, to do my best to keep my part under 30 minutes. A few logistical points here before we begin. Again, as advertised, I'll do my best to be below 30 minutes. If you have any questions while we're going through the talk today, feel free to use the GoToWebinar chat function, and we'll try to answer these along the way. We'll also have time at the end to field questions, and I also wanted to give everyone a bit of a forewarning. Some of the slides are rather information dense, and that is on purpose. Capsim will share the slides with everyone after we finish the webinar, and I wanted to put enough information in here that you can use this as a tool later on. So if you feel like you're missing anything because there's a lot of information on some of these slides, that is intentional, and Capsim will share the slides after the webinar. So I'm just going to throw out a quick question there. Am I coming through loud and clear? If anyone wants to respond, just to make sure that everything sounds great and you can hear me well. Did you unmute? All right, sounds great. Thank you for replying to that. So it's interesting. I imagine many of you out there are responsible for learning assessment. That's probably why you're attending today. So I want to just ask you a quick question. Do you ever feel like this in your role? Stranded on a foreign planet, struggling to survive? I imagine the answer is probably yes. I've done that role for a while at my own university. Over the last several years, I've helped other universities in accreditation processes, and oftentimes that's the reaction I get from folks that are in charge of learning assessment. They sort of feel alone. But I want to let you know, you're not alone. You're not alone in the feeling as if you have never gotten formal training in program evaluation. In fact, the vast majority of individuals responsible for learning assessment have never taken a formal course on program evaluation. You're also not alone in terms of the amount of support that exists out there. There is a substantial amount of scholarship on program evaluation, dating back decades and decades. So there's a lot of support out there, and there's a lot of information we could use to distill different kinds of best practices to make our jobs as those responsible for learning assessment easier and more effective. Now, we could spend a lot longer than 30 minutes talking about program evaluation, obviously, because there's so much scholarship on it. I really wanted to boil it down to four key questions, or four key issues that will inform your learning assessment if we draw from the vast literature on program evaluation. And so I thought four key questions might be something like this. What do we want to instill? How do we measure it? When do we measure it? And why in the world are we doing this? And so we're going to use the program evaluation literature to inform these key questions that hopefully will improve our learning assessment processes for accreditation purposes. Now, I say program evaluation. It's a very broad domain. We're going to focus probably mostly on the training evaluation segment of evaluating programs. So let's jump right into this. So if we think of that first question, what do we want to instill in our students? So at first blush, you might think, well, this is a really easy question to address. Basically, it's the content of our learning goals, right? That's what we want to instill in our students. And so here you can see some really common learning goals. You'll recognize a lot of these content areas, so cross-functional business expertise, communication, leadership and teaming, issues around international and global concerns, as well as things such as decision-making and critical thinking. But what's interesting here is, sure, that is the content of our various learning goals, but the content of our learning goals doesn't necessarily tell us what learning looks like. To figure out what the form of learning is, it's a little bit more complicated. We have to turn to the verbs that we use in our learning goals. And oftentimes, to be honest, people don't really think about this very much when they're writing their learning goals. Because these verbs, things like acquire knowledge, understand and apply, recognize and address, know and appreciate, these communicate the type of learning that's occurring. So if you think about these words that are highlighted right now, what in the world does it mean to know or to apply? Or better yet, what in the world does appreciate mean? And you have to be able to define it before you can actually measure it, which is ultimately what we're trying to do with learning assessment, is measure this kind of learning. So this is where we come to our first contribution from the program evaluation literature. And that contribution is learning is multidimensional, right? We'll call it the ABCs of learning just to make it easier to remember. So learning is multifaceted. You have affective, behavioral, and cognitive outcomes of learning. And to assess this, you sort of have to understand this first. So let's talk a little bit about cognitive outcomes. So here we're talking about learning outcomes that are knowledge-based, recalling facts, principles, rules, models. Let's say standard accounting practices, for example. Then we're moving from knowledge to doing, to acting. So here we have behavioral outcomes. These are skill-based learning outcomes, proficient demonstration, successfully applying your knowledge in a behavioral way. Classic example here is delivering an effective speech, so oral communication. You can usually see behavioral outcomes. And last but not least, we have affective outcomes. So these are attitudinal based. So think of attitudes towards business ethics, attitudes towards social responsibility, attitudes towards evidence-based decision making. And so here, oftentimes, we're talking about how people feel about learning itself. So self-efficacy, for example, the confidence in your capability to perform. So if you think of these various aspects of learning, and I ask, well, which one do you think business schools spend most of their time assessing? Probably popping up into your mind is the bottom, right? The idea of cognitive outcomes. And this is where we spend the vast majority of our time doing assessment. The unfortunate aspect of this is only 1/3 of the learning landscape, if you will, right? We spend most of our time capturing cognitive outcomes, not that much doing behavioral outcomes, and far less doing affective outcomes. All are equally important. There's been a lot written about this and the struggles of business schools to instill applied managerial and business knowledge, often called the knowing-doing gap. And some authors have attributed our emphasis on cognitive outcomes as a key contributor to the knowing-doing gap that our students often graduate with. They can know it, they know it well, but have struggle doing it or struggle in doing it. So one of the key takeaways here from a practical standpoint of recognizing that learning is multidimensional is if you know that learning is multidimensional, you can now link these forms of learning to your goals in a more meaningful way. And when you link it to your goals, it allows you to figure out, how do I measure it? And by it, I'm really saying the desired learning outcomes, right? What you're trying to change and instill. And so look, we have all of these different methods we can use and bring to bear in learning assessment. These look very familiar, I'm sure, to everyone out there. So the key implication here is we have this variety of methods, right? And so not as many methods, not all these methods are interchangeable. And when I say interchangeable, I mean they're not interchangeable in how well they assess different forms of learning. Some are better than others. And it also raises the question, well, how do I link these variety of methods that I have to the types of learning outcomes I want to assess? And this leads us to our second contribution from the program evaluation literature, and that is, no matter what method you choose, you need to recognize that any given measurement is always going to be imperfect. There's no such thing as a single perfect measure, right? And the reason this happens is that, essentially when we're capturing all these data, what we're really trying to do is look at outcomes to form judgments, right? To make comparisons, to make inferences. So in our cases, did students actually learn? Is our program of high quality? Is it working? But from the program evaluation literature, it reminds us that when you're assessing something and using it as a criterion for a basis for judgment, inherently you run into what they call the criterion problem. And this is the difficulty in measuring anything that's multidimensional. And we've already established that learning itself is multidimensional. There's the ABCs of learning. And I'll sort of depict this graphically so you can sort of get a better understanding of why this matters, this idea of the criterion problem. So imagine you have, in the blue circle, all that represents true learning, whatever it might be, let's say leadership, right? Then in the green circle, you have everything you're actually capturing, the things that are measured in your learning assessment. Now we would hope in practice that there be a strong overlap here, that you're measuring things that represent true learning. And to the extent to which there is an overlap, we would call that valid assessment. But in reality, we're never going to have complete overlap, right? We're always going to have something in there that we call contamination, things that we're measuring that aren't true learning. So call that noise, error. Then we have things that we should be measuring, but we're not. So we'll call those the deficiency of our measures. So take, for example, you might have a leadership learning goal, and the only way you measure that is through essays and exams. Highly deficient in terms of learning assessment for something that's around leadership skills, right? So the key takeaway here is, of course, we want to maximize our overlap, the validity with which we assess our learning outcomes and our learning goals. The second implication is that you may need to use more than one measure to do that. This brings us to our third contribution from the program evaluation literature, and this is, how do we link assessment methods that exist? Remember, we have this variety of methods. How do we link those to the ABCs of learning outcomes that then allow us to tie it to our learning goals? There's been an awful lot of research on this over the past 50 to 60 years to try to figure out what are the optimal measures for different kinds of learning outcomes. I'm going to show you a summary table here that sort of articulates and summarizes this vast literature on this topic. So let's take first cognitive outcomes, the very common ones we're used to seeing in university settings. So here we're talking about concepts such as knowing about, how to organize that knowledge, and then knowing how to apply something, right? Cognitive strategies. The common methods we usually bring to bear that are optimal to measure these kinds of outcomes should look rather familiar to us. So thinking about declarative knowledge, knowing about something, written oral exams, whether they measure recognition like multiple choice tests, or whether they measure recall as an essay or short answer exams, these are optimal. These do a very good job in validly and efficiently measuring declarative knowledge. Moving now to knowledge organization, you can use techniques such as concept mapping, measuring mental models, all the way down to cognitive strategies. So think of the case scenarios we often use, the problem sets we give our students. These things are truly optimal for measuring cognitive outcomes around cognitive strategies. Now, if you blow this down from knowing to doing into the behavioral realm of learning outcomes, we're talking about acquiring skills, automaticity, things such as proficient demonstration of the knowledge we've gained of learning, as well as fluent demonstration, so how fast and accurate you can demonstrate a given skill. So here the optimal methods might be things such as simulations, assessment centers, oral presentations, behavioral observations, performance ratings that we capture when people are performing. And then now as we go all the way down from knowing to doing to feeling about it, we have attitudes and motivational aspects. Those are the concepts of affective outcomes. So here are things that, such as the attitude strength, effort, persistence, engagement, and these kinds of outcomes. Here we use methods primarily that are self-report and method. These are the optimal approaches. Of course, you want to use self-reports that are based on high-quality measurements, validated scales that exist out there. But you can also bring to bear other kinds of methods, such as participation rates. If you measure how long people spend on given tasks, so time on task metrics can also be brought to bear. If you just look for a moment down that far right column and sort of think about how learning assessment is done at your school, or other schools with whom you might have people that are in your role elsewhere. As you move from top to bottom, you can sort of see that the methods that are brought to bear that are optimal aren't nearly as frequent as you move from top to bottom. So not only are we spending most of our time on cognitive outcomes, oftentimes that's where we're using the optimal methods, but as we move down towards behavioral and affective, these kinds of methods become quite rare, and they shouldn't be, because they are the best methods to assess these different kinds of learning outcomes. So now that we've sort of linked our learning goals to learning outcomes, which allowed us to then link to different optimal methods, we can now address this third question. When in the world do I measure this stuff, these learning outcomes? Two general questions here to answer. The first of which is, what kind of conclusions do you want to draw? And then where do you expect these outcomes to occur? When we're talking about conclusions we want to draw, it really boils down to deciding whether or not you want to assess for proficiency, or do you want to assess for change? And this is very goal specific. Some goals you might want change, some you might want proficiency. But this helps you address how often do you need to measure that particular learning goal, right? Once you figure out if you're interested in proficiency or change, then it allows you to think about, well, where do we expect these outcomes to occur? That is, where are we teaching this content? When do we think students can demonstrate these learning outcomes? So if you're thinking of your program overall from start to finish, and you think of your general curriculum you have in that program, where is this content most likely to be taught and then demonstrated? So just as an example, let's say we have 12 courses in our curriculum. In this case, we might have learning goal 1 and 2 assessed in the first class and the fourth class, but we also are interested in assessing for change. So we're not only going to assess that in course 1 and 4, but also assess those in our last course as well. Whereas learning goal 3, we're really interested in only assessing for proficiency. So we're just capturing that closest to where it occurs in course 8. There's one final point I want to make here after doing some accreditation consulting over a number of years now. There's some missed opportunities here, right? A lot of us will look at our formal curriculum and try to map it out, but we should also think more broadly about our programs. We shouldn't just think of the formal curriculum, but we should also think of what else coincides with our programs, our co-curricular opportunities and activities, our boot camps, our orientation programs, speaker series, and these sorts of things. There are a lot of additional assessment opportunities that occur outside the formal curriculum that can provide very efficient and effective assessment opportunities that you can integrate into your overall assurance of learning processes. So if we think about where, we've answered these questions about where we want to assess our outcomes, it leads us to the fourth contribution from the program evaluation literature, and that is what are the classic evaluation designs. So post-test only, pre-test, post-test, can we use a control group or a comparison group, or do we want to embark on a case study approach? The key thing we know from this broad literature and evaluation is that there's not one best approach. They all have benefits and drawbacks. There's trade-offs for each. So most schools do a post-test only approach. I've seen over the last maybe sort of 2-3 years, schools are all now sort of moving towards assessing for change in pre-test, post-test, but the vast majority of learning assessment still is a post-test approach. Why? Well, it's very efficient. It allows you to document for proficiency. But it does have some drawbacks. You can't depict change. Oftentimes, it doesn't provide really direct data that your specific course or your intervention is the primary cause of the change. Moving down to sort of the control group, it's fantastic. It's sort of the gold standard of evaluation design, but often quite difficult and complex to implement in a lot of school environments. I mean, it's difficult to find a group that's not going to go through your curriculum. But there are inventive ways of doing this. Oftentimes, if you have cohorts going through, you can use the pre-test of a subsequent cohort that hasn't gotten the courses yet as a control group for a group that's already gone through the program. So there are inventive ways to manufacture control groups, but it does require more time and implementation struggles. Last but not least, we have case studies. Here, just think of you're writing a giant book report, right, on your evaluation. It's fantastic in terms of the depth and detail and the nuances it provides. Very time intensive and very difficult to generalize across different kinds of programs. So these are the kinds of questions that come about and can be informed by the program evaluation literature around when are we going to do this. But then our final question, of course, is why are we doing this, right? And I know many of you are saying, because my dean told me to. I totally get it. I've been there. I understand that. But beyond the idea that you've been assigned this task to be responsible for high-quality learning assessment, there are other reasons, right, of why we do this. So if you think of accrediting bodies and any kind of learning assessment procedures, it all follows the same kind of paradigm. Everything flows from our mission. Our mission informs the goals we assign. We figure out the outcomes that inform these goals, and then the results allow us to take actions. And there's supposed to be this feedback loop, this continual feedback loop around our learning assessment procedures. We collect all our data at the student level, but we do a lot of our interpretations and our interventions at the program level. Okay, so that makes sense. That's one of the reasons why we do this. Our fifth contribution from the program evaluation literature says, well, wait a second, there's really two broad purposes to doing evaluation in general. We have what's known as formative evaluation and then summative evaluation. So summative evaluation is what we're kind of used to. This is evaluating learning, collecting outcomes, documenting these outcomes. This is what we normally think about when we think of learning assessment, assurance of learning stuff. But there's also an equally important form of evaluation and purpose, and that's called formative evaluation. So here, instead of focusing on outcomes, you're focused on process. You're focused on overall program enhancements. In terms of how often is this frequently done in the school environment for accreditation, most people do a summative evaluation because you have to. You need to provide outcome data. Very few schools do formative evaluation. So I'll give you an example of formative evaluation. It can be as simple as asking your faculty, how well do you think our learning assessment is working? Are you using these learning assessment data for accreditation to inform how well you teach? Are you making changes to your courses? Are students getting developmental feedback from the kinds of things that we're doing for accreditation purposes? These kinds of process-oriented questions are incredibly important. Oh, and by the way, they make it a lot easier to write your report when you're talking about how you're closing the loop in your accreditation process. So we talked about a lot of information here on our way to getting a quote-unquote executive doctorate in program evaluation. I just want to do a quick recap here before I show you some real-life examples to kind of hammer some of this home. So we've talked about these four key questions, right? What do we want to instill? How do we want to measure it? When do we want to measure it? And why are we doing this? And so we've talked about the idea of using the program evaluation literature to link our goals to the ABCs of learning outcomes. Why? Because once we do that, we can link these outcomes to the optimal ways to measure our goals. And then we talked about once we determine that, are we measuring it for proficiency or change? That informs where we capture these these measures. And then last but not least, also considering, well, why are we even doing this in terms of an evaluation standpoint to better leverage our actions for program improvement, for both formative and summative evaluation. So there's a lot of information. I wanted to spend a moment here sort of showing you what this might look like. So here are three common learning goals that business schools often find very difficult to assess. Something around critical thinking and decision making, something around sort of the quote-unquote soft skills, so we have leadership, teamwork, interpersonal skills, and then something around ethical decision-making and legal implications in business. So we think of these three common goals that business schools often struggle to assess. What are the kinds of learning outcomes that can be attached to that? So each of these learning goals has a cognitive, an affective, and a behavioral component, and you can see some examples here on screen. So I'll just briefly talk about a couple here. So if we look at critical thinking and decision-making, clearly there's cognitive outcomes we care about, like what are your decision-making models you're applying? Are you following a rational decision-making model? With the learning goal 2 around leadership, there's clearly behavioral outcomes can you demonstrate leadership skills? Can you demonstrate and make effective contributions to the teams that you're on? And down at the learning goal 3, we're talking about ethics. There are affective outcomes such as, do you even accept business ethics as something that's important? Do you have confidence in your capability to follow an ethical decision-making model? So the idea here is you're identifying these different outcomes, which allows you to identify where you can assess this and the methods you might bring to bear. So for example, you determine you care about goal 1 and goal 3, only assessing proficiency, whereas that second goal you want to assess proficiency and change. This informs where and how many times you do the assessment. So let's take that top goal, for example. We know the optimal methods for capturing cognitive, behavioral, and affective outcomes should entail things beyond just exams. So we have a marketing and a management class. So in our marketing class, we have two different case analyses that we'll use to capture critical thinking and decision making. That'll tap into cognitive outcomes for sure. But we also want behavioral outcomes. So in our management class, we have a business simulation assessment. Here people not only have to know how to apply business principles, but actually make real decisions and see the products of those decisions. So that taps into the behavioral aspect and cognitive aspect. And last but not least, maybe we require an oral presentation after they complete that business assessment where they have to describe how they made their decisions and why, and the extent to which they engage in cross-functional decision-making and exhibit evidence-based attitudes that gets at affective outcomes. So hopefully that kind of gives you an example of how this can be applied across these different learning outcomes and different learning goals. So, we've talked a lot about this notion of how do we link our goals to our outcomes and then to the optimal methods. And it seems rather easy, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily seem that complicated as we laid it out here in the webinar. I think one of the key obstacles for most people that are responsible for this at universities is that we don't often step back and take this macro level view of what we're doing when we do learning assessment. We're in the weeds, we're shaking faculty, trying to get them to give us whatever we can to operationalize our goals, and so it's hard for us to step back and say, what are we really trying to do here? How does all this connect together? And that therein is the value of applying a program and evaluation mindset. It forces you to think about what the relevant outcomes are and how I should measure those. And you do that before you go out and start looking at where to embed these in different courses or in co-curricular activities. That's the true value to get around that obstacle, to take that more macro level view. Now, all of this, of course, really speaks to increasing the effectiveness of your overall learning assessment process. But we also care about efficiency too. Is there a way we can do this well and do it more efficiently? And there is, right? And so what I'm going to show you here is a lot of the common and optimal methods that are brought to bear for different learning outcomes, and some of the learning assessment tools that I've seen that we've used at my university and I've seen other universities use in the course of doing a lot of this accreditation consulting. Software and commercial products that can make your life a little bit easier, if you will. Now, this is one of those information-heavy slides I warned you about. Again, we'll be sharing this deck so you can go through each of these. What I try to do is summarize the benefits and drawbacks to some of these optimal methods that are used for different outcomes, some of the advantages and disadvantages. And then in that last column, I wanted to show some commercially available tools that we've used at DePaul and other schools have used quite well to make this a little bit easier to capture some of these different kinds of learning outcomes. And I just wanted, for the moment, to highlight three in particular that we've used at DePaul, just to kind of talk about how well these things work. So at DePaul, for example, we're really concerned with whether or not our students can engage, not only demonstrate knowledge, but also skills, know and do, particularly around cross-functional business decision-making and critical thinking. And to capture that knowledge and behavior, particularly around behavior, we use Capsim, which is a simulation-based assessment. Essentially requires students to go in, run their own business, make decisions, interpret information. They're also being asked questions throughout. So it allows a knowledge and a skill-based assessment. And we use that for a number of our goals, but most particular our critical thinking and decision making. What's interesting about Capsim, if you wanted it to, it can speak to every single learning goal you have at your university. Components that can fit in there. We also use Capsim 360 and Teammate. Particularly, we have two goals, one around leadership and one around teamwork competencies. Capsim 360, in brief, is just a multi-source leadership assessment. And we use that in our MBA program. It's embedded in a particular course. Here, students are gathering information from their peers and their boss and direct reports if they have them in the workplace. Students use this information for developmental purposes. They do an individual development plan for improvement. We as an institution use these data to gauge where our students are in terms of their key managerial and leadership skills. Other universities I've seen do this and assess for change, where they'll use Capsim 360 at an orientation when students come in, and then at a subsequent course later in the curriculum, they'll again give that assessment to see if people improved as a result of going through their program. We also use Teammates at DePaul. This is a peer evaluation tool. We use it in several different courses. It can be used in any course that has a team project. So we use it in a variety of courses. And the interesting thing here is it uses peer evaluations to capture really important information that separates out effective and ineffective teamwork. And we use this to inform our team-related learning goal. So hopefully you found this effective here, and some of these tools will be helpful to you. I strongly encourage, if there's a tool that you've been using that's not up here, feel free to send that in, because I'd love to incorporate that in a lot of these talks that we often do. And again, it goes back to that idea that you're not alone. There's a lot of people out there that have similar struggles, and the extent to which we can share tools that work really well, it's a fantastic way to make this a little bit easier for us. Now, you're a newly minted evaluation guru, right? We've gone through the ways of leveraging program evaluation to improve learning assessment. Let's say you go back, you apply all of this, you revamp, you beef up your learning assessment processes. You've hit the mark, all your measures, they're highly valid, you're linking them to learning goals. You've been collecting all these data. Now the time, a year later, 2 years from now, let's say, now you need to compile and crunch all these numbers. One thing I find really interesting that I've heard over the years is I have all this great data, right? But now what do? What am I supposed to report? What am I supposed to document? And that is a key struggle, a key obstacle. Sure, accrediting bodies have standard reporting templates and these sorts of things that can help you sort of organize your different results. But what really makes for an effective report? What should we talk about? What should go in there? What should I say? What should I not say? When we're really talking about documentation, this is something I've heard a lot of people ask questions when I've given seminars and webinars on this. And because of that, Capsim asked if I do a follow-up webinar to this one. So now we've talked about what to measure and how to make it easier and more effective. I have all these data. What do I do with it next? And this sort of brings us to what's going to be the next webinar that Capsim's asked me to do, and happily I agreed, which is really this idea, what do I need to say? Tips for effective assessment documentation. So here we're going to talk a little bit about what do I analyze, what do I report, what makes for a good report, what are some key differentiators to make my job a little bit easier and to make these reviews go a little bit better for my institution. I want to thank you for your attendance. I think I hit it right on the mark. I might be 30 minutes and 30 seconds. If there's any questions right now, I'll field some. Again, this deck will be made available. We'll send this out. Everyone's nodding to me. Thank you. And also, as Carter mentioned earlier, this is a part of a broader accreditation and learning assessment webinar series. You can see the titles of the other topics here, and those are all online. Not only are these fantastic for making your assessment easier, more effective, if you're battling cases of insomnia, sometimes my voice is really good at putting people to sleep, so maybe you could use it for that too. Always try to end on a joke. I hate it. So I'm going to look at some questions here. I'll read them out loud. So someone's asking for, could you send some sample questions that might be used for various categories of learning? Yeah, I can do that. There's a couple really fantastic chapters that have been written in various handbooks. I referenced one of them earlier in that one matrix by Bob Rubin and Lynn Martell that have a lot of examples of this. Sure, be more than happy to apply to sort of show some examples of where you can do these assessments. What else do we have here? Yeah, and someone's asking if the PowerPoint slides will be available. Yes, they will. Oh, here's a really good one. So, let me read it here before I read it out loud to everybody. Okay. Okay, so someone's asking this idea. You've mentioned some of the products that you use at DePaul, and thank you for some of the other examples. Are there any other resources for some of these products? That's a good question. So some of these products that I've seen other universities use, I've seen them talk at ACSB, ACBSP on their use of products. Most of these that are commercially available, it's really easy to get a demo. For example, 4Class is one that we've used at DePaul quite a bit for case studies, right, and how to do that. For any of the Capsim related products, there's demos also in the webinar series that you're seeing on the screen right now. Many of those tools are used as specific examples in these webinars, so you can get even more information around Capsim 360 or CompXM or Teammates. Other than that, I think beyond demos, if there's a really specific one you want to get a little bit more information on, and you want to know what schools are using it, send me an email. I can usually reach out to the people that I know at those schools to put you in touch with them. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. This is a really well-attended one. I hope everybody got something out of it, and the next one, we're going to get into more of the meat of it. Right, Eric?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks so much, Eric.